The song was supposed to be a joke. At least, that was what I told myself when my secretary stepped onto the tiny stage after work, took the microphone with trembling hands, and looked directly at me. The room was crowded, the lights were low, and everyone was laughing and drinking after another exhausting week at the office. Then the music started, and she began to sing a duet about two lonely people who were too afraid to admit they needed each other. But when she reached the final line, she stopped looking at the crowd. She looked only at me. And with a voice so soft that I almost thought I had imagined it, she sang, "Take me home with you." For a few seconds, nobody moved. Neither did I. Because the truth was, I had spent the last year pretending that my secretary was just an employee, when deep inside, she had become the person who knew my sadness better than anyone. If you believe kindness can change lives, that people deserve second chances, and that sometimes love begins with simply being there for someone, please take a moment to like this story, share it with someone who needs hope, and subscribe to the channel for more heart-touching stories. My name is Daniel, and at 38, I had become very good at looking successful while quietly falling apart. I was the owner of a growing logistics company, the kind of man people described as disciplined, ambitious, and fortunate. My office was on the 22nd floor of a glass building overlooking the city. I drove an expensive car, wore tailored suits, and attended meetings where people shook my hand as though they were touching the future. But every evening, when the elevator doors opened onto my apartment, there was only silence waiting for me. My marriage had ended 3 years earlier. There had been no dramatic betrayal, no shouting match, no single moment that could explain everything. We had simply become two people living beside each other instead of with each other. When the divorce was finalized, I told everyone I was fine. I wasn't. Then came Emily. She became my secretary almost 2 years after my divorce. She was 29, intelligent, organized, and possessed a strange ability to notice things I desperately wanted people to ignore. She knew when I had skipped lunch. She knew when a meeting had gone badly before I said a word. She knew that I drank coffee when I was stressed but tea when I was genuinely tired. She never asked invasive questions. She simply cared. One winter morning, I arrived at the office after spending half the night in the hospital with my father, who had suffered a serious health scare. I hadn't told anyone. I had barely slept, and I was prepared to bury myself in work. Emily looked at me once and quietly cancelled my first meeting. I protested, but she refused to change it. She left a sandwich on my desk, placed a cup of tea beside it, and told me that being the boss didn't make me indestructible. That was the first time someone had said those words to me without wanting something in return. My father's condition eventually improved, but the experience changed me. I started noticing Emily more. Not in the careless way people sometimes notice attractive coworkers. It was deeper than that. I noticed how she stayed late when the office was chaotic. I noticed how she remembered birthdays nobody else cared about. I noticed how she once spent her lunch break helping the elderly janitor fill out an online form because he couldn't understand the website. One evening, I found her crying quietly in an empty conference room. She immediately wiped her eyes and apologized for being emotional at work. I asked what was wrong. She eventually told me that her younger brother had been struggling with addiction. Her family had spent years trying to help him, and every time they believed he was recovering, another setback came. She felt exhausted, guilty, and helpless. I didn't give her some inspirational speech. I simply sat there. That night, she told me later, was the first time in months she hadn't felt alone. Perhaps that was how our friendship began. We never crossed a professional boundary. During office hours, she was my secretary and I was her employer. We were careful. But after work, occasionally, we talked. Not about romance. Not about dreams. About life. She told me she wanted to open a small bakery someday. I told her I had once wanted to travel across Europe but had spent so many years chasing success that I had forgotten how to take vacations. We laughed about our failures. We shared quiet moments. And somewhere along the way, without either of us noticing, she became the person I looked for whenever I entered a room. Then came Friday night. The company had just finished a brutal quarter, and the employees decided to celebrate at a small music lounge downtown. I almost didn't go. Crowds exhausted me, and I had planned to return home and work. Emily caught me as I was leaving. She didn't ask me to stay. She simply told me that sometimes people needed to celebrate surviving difficult seasons. So I went. The evening started normally. People laughed, ordered food, and told embarrassing stories about office mistakes. I sat near the back, watching everyone enjoy themselves. Then the host announced a duet challenge. Someone from our company pushed Emily toward the stage. She resisted at first, laughing nervously, but eventually accepted. I expected her to sing something funny. Instead, she chose a slow song about two people who had spent years hiding their loneliness behind busy lives. When the music began, the entire room seemed to soften. Emily sang beautifully. But there was something different in her expression. She kept looking toward me. At first I convinced myself it was coincidence. Then she sang the first verse about someone who had forgotten what it felt like to come home to another person. My heart tightened. The second verse was about being afraid to ask someone to stay. By then, I knew. This wasn't random. My hands became cold. When she reached the final line, she lowered the microphone slightly. Her eyes met mine, and her expression wasn't playful anymore. She sang, "Take me home with you." The room erupted in applause. Someone whistled. Someone shouted that I had better respond. But I couldn't move. Emily stepped off the stage and walked toward me. For the first time since I had known her, she looked genuinely afraid. She wasn't asking for a physical invitation. She was asking something much bigger. She was asking whether there was a place for her in the life I had carefully kept empty. I stood and followed her outside. The city was cold, and rain had started falling. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then she admitted that she hadn't planned to say those words. She had only wanted me to understand what she couldn't explain normally. She said she cared about me. Not because I was her boss. Not because I was successful. Not because I could give her anything. She cared because she had seen the lonely man behind the expensive suit. And she was tired of pretending she didn't want to stand beside him. I confessed that I had been afraid too. Afraid that if I admitted what I felt, I would lose the one person at work who made the hardest days bearable. Afraid that love would become another thing I could fail at. She smiled sadly and told me that love wasn't a business contract. There were no guarantees. Only choices. That night, I didn't take her home. Instead, I took her to a quiet 24-hour cafe, where we sat for hours talking about everything we had been too afraid to say. We decided that if there was going to be something between us, we would do it honestly. I arranged for her to transfer to another department under a different manager, removing the direct professional relationship between us. We didn't rush. We didn't pretend one song could solve years of loneliness. Emily continued supporting her brother, and eventually he entered a treatment program that gave him a real chance at recovery. My father recovered enough to return home, and for the first time in years, I began visiting him every Sunday instead of hiding behind work. Months passed. One evening, I returned to my apartment after a long day. The lights were on. The smell of fresh bread filled the hallway. Emily was in the kitchen, experimenting with a recipe for the bakery she had once dreamed about. She looked up and smiled. And suddenly, I understood what she had really meant that night. Take me home with you had never been about a house. It had been about belonging. It had been about finding a place where two tired people could finally stop pretending they were strong enough to carry everything alone. A year later, Emily opened her bakery. It was small, warm, and imperfect. The first morning, only a few customers came. But my father was there. Her brother was there. And I was standing behind the counter with flour on my shirt, laughing as Emily tried to convince me that I was terrible at decorating cakes. There were no grand speeches. No perfect ending. Just people who had survived difficult seasons and chosen not to give up on one another. Sometimes, life doesn't change with a dramatic miracle. Sometimes, it changes with a cup of tea left quietly on a desk. Sometimes, it changes when someone notices you're hurting and sits beside you without asking you to explain. And sometimes, the person who helps you find your way home isn't the person you expected. If this story touched your heart, please like, share, and subscribe. Your support helps these stories reach someone who may be quietly struggling and needs a reminder that they are not alone. And before you leave, comment, "I choose kindness," if you believe that everyone deserves a second chance and that no one should have to face life's hardest moments alone. Because in the end, home isn't always a place. Sometimes, home is simply the person who looks at your broken heart and says, without fear, you don't have to carry it by yourself anymore.